Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 225 and the beginning of year 5 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. A lot of medieval history, and history in general, involves colonization, not just of unoccupied lands, but of lands in which human settlements had already been firmly established. Often, the stories we tell focus on the takeovers themselves and the circumstances that led up to them. But what happens to the people when the dust settles? How do they manage the clash of two cultures and often two law codes? And how do the stories they tell about themselves and each other help them navigate society? This week, I spoke with Dr. Joanna MacGugan about social memory, politics, justice, and death in medieval Ireland. Jo was a copy editor with Dragonfly Editorial and an independent scholar whose work spans Arthurian literature, medieval Irish justice, and reputation in early modern witchcraft trials. Her new book is Social Memory, Reputation, and the Politics of Death in the Medieval Irish Lordship. Our conversation on how the justice system worked in Ireland under medieval English rule, how communities shaped justice, and what this meant when a person was faced with capital punishment is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Jo, for joining me to talk about Ireland and law and orality and all sorts of amazing stuff. It's great to meet you and have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
It's my pleasure. So, Ireland, we have an English presence there. How did that happen? How did the English end up in Ireland?
Well, the short story is in 1169, Diarmaid MacMurrough, he was the king of Leinster. He lost his throne to his rival, Rory O'Connor, and he begged Henry II of England for help to reclaim his throne. So Henry sent Welsh and Norman knights to aid him, and they basically enjoyed the Irish countryside so much they decided to stay and settle there. You see a lot of second sons going to Ireland to settle because there wasn't a lot of land available in England at the time. I went to the first sons. So they settled in, and Henry, he governed Ireland as a lordship of the crown. So as a colonial situation. So in the period that I study is mostly the 13th and 14th centuries. It's about 100 years after colonization. You see the Irish, the English, Scots, Norse populations all intermingling and integrating. So it's very much melting pot in Ireland at the time.
And where are people mostly situated? So if we're looking at the island, where is the English presence mostly found?
They're concentrated on the East Coast. So the eastern seaboard was mostly English. And then they did branch inland. You'll see little pockets of Irish lordships within the English territory. But for the most part, the eastern seaboard was English, and the western seaboard remained under Irish control. So it was never a complete conquest, which is one reason that the medieval lordship sort of faltered in the late Middle Ages, because they didn't have a complete conquest. The Irish there were always Irish lordships that resisted colonization and rebelled against it. So power shifted a lot, allegiances shifted. There were some Irish that allied with the English, and there were some that rebelled and denied colonization. So there's a lot happening.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's expected when you have people showing up on your shores. You're not really going to necessarily be ready to play nicely with them. Although
No.
with this kind of situation, there's always, and one of the things you mentioned in the book, some people that are willing to bend and other people who are not. So what were some of the justifications that the English had for staying and for thinking that they were able to rule or should rule over a population that had already been there for a very long time?
It was power. It was land and power. And I want to say hubris a little bit. I mean, which is the case in most, colonization. I think it was sort of an early idea of empire, this idea that they could take over these neighboring countries that they saw as less than civilized. The Irish, there was a long-standing idea among the English that the Irish were uncivilized. They were savages. And the English, as superiors, they had the right to that land and to show them the light. Which again, you also often see in other colonial contexts. So that idea of the Irish as very savage, that persisted for a very long time. And that was one of the factors in colonization there.
Right. And so they're not very shy about this in England. They're saying this law, I think it was Edward the First that said this law is basically no law at all. It's just completely savage. So we need to bring our law and we need to impose it on the people. But it wasn't that simple, was it? How did the law work when you had two different laws in the same space at the same
Ugh,
time?
it was a mess. So in theory, English common law prevailed in the areas under English control. But then you have in the marches and in the fringes of the colony, you have sort of a hybrid situation they called marcher law, which wasn't officially recognized like it was in Wales at the time, but it was a lot of private lordships, sort of adopted elements of the native Gaelic law in legal systems and legal culture and used it in their private manor courts. So you saw a hybrid situation. Sometimes they would appeal to English common law, and sometimes they would appeal to Gaelic law when it sort of suited their interests the best.
It's
So
pretty
yeah, again,
smart.
yeah, there's a lot going on there, and it's hard to untangle except for sort of in a local context.
Hmm. And I imagine over the course of your research doing this whole century that it's evolving over time, right? It's
Yes,
solidifying and
right.
people are starting to close those doors into possible avenues, right?
Yes, and I mean, common law was evolving at the time too. More laws were becoming, recorded in writing, but the common law was sort of still in development. So yeah, it's fascinating to look at sort of on the ground how that played out in very local contexts. That's what I enjoy.
Yeah, yeah. And especially when you're looking at these individual cases and you have these characters coming up that are super fun. And do want to get into those
Sure.
shortly. But we are talking, or we're going to be talking soon when we're talking about court cases, especially about the importance of oral culture. And we know that the Irish were doing amazing work when it came to creating books at this time. So it's not like literacy is unknown to the Irish population and then the English show up and then everyone's literate. But can you give us a sense of what the culture was like in Ireland among the Native Irish when it comes to orality and literacy? How is that working among that population?
That I didn't look at as closely. So I don't know if I can speak to it as coherently as maybe my advisor could. He does look at Brendan Kane. He does study the Irish, what was happening in the Gaelic Irish societies. But I would say it was very sophisticated. I mean, we had Irish poets composing written poetry. We had, well, a lot of the laws were written down. I mean, it was, I think, on a par with what we see happening in mainland Europe, that, literacy was just, and of course, I mean, the early Irish monks were responsible for so much of European literacy and creating manuscripts and all that. So it was a very learned society. Absolutely. There was a lot happening there with taking orality and committing it to manuscripts.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that one of the bits of Irish culture that starts to infuse itself into the English colonial culture there is the bardic poetry, especially, and people are
Hmm.
taking on this way of telling stories that was already in Ireland before the English showed up and integrating that. And sometimes the people in England are not super happy about that, right?
Right. But who wouldn't want, a bard on staff to sing their praises,
Yeah.
and to come to their dinners and entertain? Like, I think it's brilliant to see the English adopting those elements.
Yeah, it would be the type of thing that I'd want to have in my castle, no matter what
Yes.
the king over the sea had to say about it, you know. It would be
Say beautiful
amazing.
words about me.
Exactly, exactly. So one of the phrases that you use in this book, especially when it's coming to legal matters and sort of the evolution of how literacy is happening at this time, you're talking about pragmatic literacy. So what do you mean by this?
Pragmatic literacy is sort of literate practices. So that the kind of literacy that someone would acquire in the course of like everyday business. So someone might not necessarily be able to read, but they could keep a counting book. They knew the importance of archiving important documents, that those kind of practices. That's what, pragmatic literacy was. So if they couldn't read, they could still recognize the importance of the written word, the written record.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really important that you say in the book as well is if somebody is peasant class, we shouldn't assume that they were illiterate by any means because they might well be educated or they might have this pragmatic literacy, as you say, right?
Yes, yeah, they signed documents, they consulted notaries, they understood all of, the importance of that.
Yeah, which is important to remember. So your book works around law as we're talking about, but you really center it on death. Why did you pick death as the sort of cohesive place to start to talk about these things?
Well, I took, as most dissertations do, a very meandering path to my final product. I started looking at death and dying. And what kind of interested me was what happens when someone dies unexpectedly or violently, or what happens when they're hanged. What are the legal dimensions there? What does the coroner do? Why is the coroner a coveted power to have? So all these questions sort of steered me towards death as the framework. And as I dove into the sources, I saw that social memory was so important in all of these contexts. In the legal culture, the foundation of this legal culture was very much oral, and social memory was a guiding force in this legal culture. So it just these two strands came together, the death and dying and the aftermath of death, and what happens to social memory as literate practices are taking root. How is social memory incorporated into this legal culture? What role does it have in deciding who faces the gallows? Questions like that, they just sort of emerged as this, interwoven braid.
Yeah, it's very hard when you're doing any history to sort of untangle things so that they cleanly come apart. So,
Yes.
so it all works together very nicely. In this book, I think you've done a good job of trying to section off one bit and talking about that. So let's come back to the coroner. We still have the office of the coroner today. In medieval Ireland, who's the coroner? How do they get that job? And what is the job?
Well, they were elected, and they were usually, local men of some prominence. But a lot of men did not want the job because there wasn't a lot of glory in it.
Hmm.
But it was very important to the crown. These were royal coroners, and they were important because they were responsible for basically collecting revenue. They would take the property of felons that would be forfeited to them, and as agents of the crown, they would give it to the king to hold. And that was very important. And that's one reason why it was, I think, a very powerful position. But you also see private coroners on private manors. The Archbishop of Dublin had his bailiff that served as coroner, even though he wasn't supposed to technically. But there isn't a lot of evidence for this in Ireland. So my focus was on the royal coroner and how he served the king and how people contested his role.
Right. So you're talking about the coroner being involved in felonies. Were they only involved with the death part, or were they involved with any felonies, even if they didn't involve visiting a body or something like that?
They had other jobs as well. They would hear abjurations from felons in sanctuary. They would take property of convicted felons. Their main role was investigating deaths, conducting inquests and things like that. But they did have other jobs as well.
Okay. So the coroner is about to investigate a death. There's a body.
Mhm.
Let's law and order it for a minute. There's a body. The coroner is called. What do they have to do?
Well, the best evidence we have for that comes from Dublin in the laws and usages. There's a passage from the early 14th century about sort of how what to do, if you find a body. So the coroner should be summoned immediately as soon as a body is discovered. But what we see in Dublin is instructions for people before the coroner's on the scene. So if the, head of household discovers a dead body, what does he do? He's supposed to summon his neighbors, 12 neighbors at least, if he can, ask them to vouch for him that he didn't do this and none of his family did this. This is just a dead body he found. And then they were sort of supposed to establish a collective truth before the coroner arrives on the scene. Once the coroner arrives, he must view the body. It was illegal to bury a body without view of the coroner. And then he would conduct his inquest into what happened. The jurors would be neighbors as well. So they would have ideally the best knowledge of the people involved in the crime. If they knew who the victim was, if they knew who the killer was, they were the ones to consult. So the coroner's inquest would be the first step in establishing that truth about what happened.
And so they bring the jury together eventually. And they've actually written down those oaths that a juror is supposed to take. And as you mentioned, the sort of oath that the person who finds the body is supposed to take. So, what do these oaths involve? Are they the same as you see today, like where you put a hand on the Bible and you say you're going to tell the truth if you're a witness? Do they have the same elements? What are they like, these oaths that the jury has to take?
So the jury, yeah, they would be sort of a formal, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and
Mhm.
an early version of that. But the truth would be sort of to the best of their knowledge, based on what they know of local gossip and the person's reputation and things like that. So yeah, it was rather formal. The laws and usages of Dublin records, what exactly they're supposed to say. There's a whole script for the coroner's inquest, but I haven't found elsewhere in this kind of detail. I know in England they have similar things happening, but I haven't seen this sort of very straightforward script that they were supposed to follow. And that gives, order and organization to the inquest. It helps provide guidance to both the coroner and the jurors.
Yeah. And I think one of the things as you're talking, it's occurring to me is that it makes it seem very formalized in that we have conducted this properly because we have followed this formula. It's not just
Yes.
people saying something. Do you think that's an accurate characterization of how it's working?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if they follow the script to the T, then it sort of absolves them of any wrongdoing. And especially with the head of household who discovers the body, if he doesn't follow that script, he's in trouble. He can, he can be prosecuted for it if he doesn't follow that. So it's definitely there for, them to follow by the book. That was really interesting to me because it is the unwritten law that's been codified now, and they kept that oral element in
Mhm.
the written law. And
Yeah.
that's
And
what I love seeing is finding that and that, signs of orality in these written sources.
yeah, because behind the scenes, it's so different from what we are expecting in modern times where they're supposed to be objective and not know the people. But here, one of the points that you're making in the book is that they're building a collective social memory about this by all contributing what they know about it and talking about it. And one of the concepts that you're mentioning in the book is about fama. So, can you tell us about what this is?
Yes, this was a sort of a universal concept across medieval Europe. This idea of reputation was the most important thing. It was prized, this idea of, what a person's word is worth. It's their reputation. It's how they, hold themselves among their community, how they're respected. It decides everything. Fama can be everything. It decides how you're treated in court. It decides, whether you are hanged for a crime or not. It's so important. And this idea that it was jurors who are familiar with someone's fama that had that power to decide these cases rather than itinerant justices who they didn't have access to this, local knowledge that they do. So they relied very much, these, high colonial government authorities, they had to rely on this very local knowledge of a person's fama to make their decisions. So it empowers jurors very much. And I don't think they get enough credit for that in the historiography. I think we often see, these colonial elites governing the lordship, but they depend so much on local jurors' knowledge, their knowledge of a person's fama to really understand, what was happening throughout the lordship and who the Irish enemies were and who the Irish allies were. Like they depend so much on these local jurors. So I've
Yeah.
wandered a bit from the, the question.
No, but this is where I wanted to go with this. So, one of the lines that you have in the book is basically that the jury is controlling the justice of the community. So, it is like a community built justice. How did you see this reflected in the sentences that came down from juries? Was everybody just sent to the executioner right away?
No, that would make a colorful story though.
It would.
But they did that you see the jurors weighing fama in circumstance, social context, all of these factors, relationships, social networks, all of these were factors in their decisions. So you would see in a homicide, if the victim was known to be an Irish enemy of the king, it would be welcomed and rewarded. That was not a problem. If the victim was a common robber who just, constantly raided towns and just caused problems all the time, that's fine. We're not going to punish the killer because they benefited the peace of the community by taking this person out of the equations. And then you see the flip side, you see the reputation of the killers making a huge difference as well. So if the person who committed the crime is known to be a common robber, a constant, persistent problem in the community, then they would most likely hang. But if that person committed a crime out of, starvation, if he robbed a home because he was, it was a time of famine and he was driven to it, but otherwise had a very solid reputation in the community, then he would usually be acquitted. So it just, so much hangs on the reputation within the community.
Hmm. And how well they know each other, as in the people that you want on the jury are family members or people who
Mhm.
know you. How does this work
Yeah.
in a colonial context? So, say you're an Irish person who is living under the rule of the English and you have to call a jury. Who are you going to call to be your witnesses? Who do you think would work best for a person in this situation?
Well, I mean, it depends on proximity. If you're talking a criminal trial, it would be the closest neighbors. So it would be the person that knew you. They knew every feud, in that immediate neighborhood. So there wasn't, total control on who sits on the jury. If you're very well connected, you want those people that know you best to be on the jury. The chances of acquittal would be much, much greater. It's interesting in one of the juries we see, it was at Castle Kevin. It was an inquisition into the Archbishop of Dublin's customs. And this manor, it was at the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains, a very Irish area. So you see Irish names running through the testimony, and you also see Irish names among the jurors. So that's sort of an outlier among the Inquisitions, but that's a really great example of how the Irish really participated in justice as well.
Yeah. And I think that that is one of the arguments you make as well, is that that participation in things like justice or community increased your fama. And it was something that you wanted to make sure was part of the equation, right? So, what
Yeah.
kind of people would get greater reputations in colonized Ireland amongst the colonizers?
Oh, but that's a really good question. I think it basically comes down to just treating your neighbors well. And we see that again in the laws and usages. We see that the head of household, must not verbally abuse his neighbors that he has assembled, because that will come back to haunt him.
Hmm.
So this idea of neighborliness, cooperation, community policing, not that every, neighborhood was all, rosy and comfortable and cozy and best friends. Absolutely not. There was also, there were always feuds. But this idea that you should treat your neighbors well because it'll help you in the end. And in terms of community policing, it will help to achieve justice for the whole community, so to the greater good. It was so important. Watch your language. Don't abuse people with your tongue. That was a big part of it.
And in fact, that led to a lot of crimes in manslaughter, didn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about the ways that people might be starting a feud by throwing insults? And I'm especially thinking of what you noticed about the gendered insults that people are throwing out.
Yes, the insults. That was so much fun to read and write about the words that they used. So you see insults, often with the root cause of violence that ended in deaths in the court rolls. And they were gendered in the sense that, kind of the way you would expect that women were accused of being loose and their virtue would be under attack. That would be sort of the most common insults thrown at them. And for men, it would be, their honor, their quality of work. I mean, we see an insult towards a tailor. There was a tavern brawl in 1311, I think, where someone was drinking and he insulted the local tailor, and that started a tavern brawl and it ended in death. They fought. Someone got clubbed on the head and it ended that way. Just that idea of attacking someone's sort of overall reputation and sense of honor. It was very important to defend your honor in the time, of course. I mean, that's all over, Europe, all over England as well. But you see it happening in Ireland as well.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned was today we think of homicide as being the worst thing you can do. It is the most heavily punished. But you mentioned that in Ireland, it's outrageous crimes. So crimes that are going to make a whole community feel outraged. That would be something more like stealing from the church, where you could get off on a homicide for doing military service or paying. Can you tell us more about how that fell out, sort of how the crimes were looked at by the community? Like which ones were more important?
Yeah, so if you look at the kinds of crimes that ended in capital punishment, you see crimes against property most often. And part of this is because at the time, crimes against property were crimes against the king,
Hmm.
so they were taken more seriously. Whereas homicides, they were often excusable in many contexts. For instance, if someone was defending their honor or self-defense usually ended in acquittal. And because the jurors knew the situation, they knew the people at play, they could vouch for, yes, this happened out of self-defense, and they would be acquitted. So homicides, you often see people paying a fine to get out of homicides. Yeah, that was just sort of more common. And the pardons, you asked about the pardons. People could rely on their social networks to purchase pardons from the king. And this was the period where this was under Edward I, who was operating wars in Scotland. He was dealing with the hostile Irish and the rebellious English in Ireland. He had a lot of wars going on, many different fronts, needed soldiers. He granted pardons, just very higgledy-piggledy. This, if you
Hmm.
wanted one, if you had the means and the social networks, it was very easy to purchase a pardon for pretty much any crime that would give them immunity. And often it would be in return for military service in Scotland or Ireland. So you do see some very dastardly crimes go completely unpunished for this reason. And interesting, this was sort of a weird thing that I saw was that these people, even if they had this ill reputation, this negative fama, they were still able to rely on their social networks to secure these pardons. So that was one area where fama sort of didn't matter, that this purchase of a pardon could overrule a negative fama.
Hmm.
So that's one instance where the written record sort of trumps the social memory of this person's crimes and the reputation that follows that person.
Yeah, I was talking about gallows with Kenneth Duggan not too long ago, and we were talking a lot about how someone might be exiled or take sanctuary or that kind of thing instead of being hanged, and that this solved the problem in the same way that military service solves a problem in that that person is out of the community and they're out of their hair and they've solved the problem by not making more trouble. So did you think that that's how people saw it at the time? Like if you're doing military service, at least you're not in the community anymore.
Mhm.
That's good enough for us.
Yes, absolutely. It brings peace to the community, and that was sort of the goal, right, in the end that they wanted. And I think you also it's complicated when jurors know the people charged with crimes or they know the victims and they have to make that decision about, okay, do we send them to the gallows or not? I mean, that's a horrible decision to have to make in any
Yeah.
context. So I think there was some relief that there were these alternative paths also that yes, okay, send them to Scotland.
Yeah.
That absolves us of having to make that decision.
Yeah, for sure. And you do have a chart in the book that mentions the number of hangings. And some years, I mean, most years, it barely gets into the double digits. Some years there's only two. And I think that would really surprise people. And I think one of the reasons is a hesitation to do that to somebody that you know. One is that you could get a pardon. These are all arguments that you mentioned. But one that you also mentioned is that nobody wants to be an executioner. So let's stop for a second and talk about who's the executioner, who's doing this job, because it's not a pretty job who ends up doing this for the county.
It's not a pretty job. And I couldn't find a lot about it in the sources. I really wanted to. There, in later sources, early modern, you see more of that. And you see executioners brought from England that would do that job because the Irish did not want to, or the Old English, as they were called at the time, did not want to either. But in the medieval period, there's not a lot about who the executioners were. There's some evidence that people were sort of pushed into the job. In England, you see sometimes it's a part of the terms of rent that yes, you can rent this property from me, but you will also serve as executioner for, my private court. That happens, and it's likely that probably also happened in Ireland. I haven't found the sources to support that, but I think it's a likely scenario. It would normally be the English that would do the executions.
Yeah. It's horrible. I can't even imagine being enlisted to do that job. If it's you're just the most likely person, or we have the most leverage on you through rents or whatever,
Yeah.
you have to do the job. And it makes a lot of sense when I was speaking with Kenneth about sometimes people walking away from the gallows and just kind of not noticing that the people get cut down by someone else because it's not something that most people would want to do, especially to someone they know in the community.
Yes. And I think there was an instance of just sort of random passersby being enlisted to do it also. Just like, oh, here's a stranger to the community. Well, will I get them to do it? That would
Mhm.
happen also. Yeah, the hangings themselves were not the big public spectacles they would become, later in the early modern period. They were very much sort of, let's just do it quietly. And it was public in the sense it would take place in a public, green, public place, but it didn't draw big crowds. Nobody really wanted to see it. And they would leave them hanging normally for, maybe a matter of days until
Mhm.
someone took pity and took them down. See, it seems so foreign to the way we do things now.
Yeah. And yet, if you think about the entire context, it makes so much more sense than the thing that you might see in media where people are just so eagerly seeing someone hanged. It's like, usually, I think when you think about it being someone in the community or someone that you've had to pass judgment on, of course, you don't want to be there for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it
It's
makes a
very
lot of
dark.
sense.
It's very dark. And it's kind of fascinating that it did become this spectacle where people would be, open the pubs and it'd be almost like I don't entertainment. It's wow.
Yeah.
It's
I th-
dark.
I think it almost has to be a stranger in those contexts because personally I don't think humans are necessarily built for wanting to see that. And that's a good thing.
I think it's a good thing too. Yeah.
So how did ethnicity play out in convictions? Because I think that you were looking into like somebody with an Irish last name, are they more likely to be convicted? Are they more likely to be executed? How did that play out in the records that you looked at?
Well, I found that Irish, they were not more likely to be convicted because, again, that would just come down to their reputation in the community, but they were more likely to hang for their crimes, which is interesting. And I'm not exactly sure of the reasons why. The ethnicity it was often so murky because the Irish could purchase the power to use English law or to be protected under English common law. And justice would sort of be the same for them as it would be for, an English person. But so few people had the means to purchase those, and so few written records exist that it was social memory, basically, that would sort out who was Irish and who was not. It depended on local knowledge and social memory again. And it was complicated because you would see Irish people adopting English names to sort of try to pass themselves off as English without that, record that they had the power of English law. And you see killers claiming that their victims were Irish so they would secure a lesser punishment and hope that the jury would back them up. Or you see juries actually protecting, the killer because they were well connected. There was one murderer. His community sort of helped him get out of several homicides, several charges. And in one case, he claimed his victim was Irish. The coroner's inquest jury also said the victim was Irish, but then a later trial jury said no, this victim was English, and it should have been a harsher penalty for this murder. So it's complicated. It's the ethnicity is it relied so much on what the jurors present as the truth. So they
Mhm.
had the power to create the truth that they wanted.
And one of the things that you mentioned that I really thought about, and I think is really interesting if we think about it in a modern context when it comes to like social media and canceling people and stuff like that, where if you're constructing a social memory of a person and their fama, it's always in the present, in that everyone might be aware of past events and things like that, but it's always, I think, a lot more balanced towards how are they acting in the community in the last year, in the last 2 years, rather than what they may have done as a youth. Do you think that is, again, like an accurate characterization of how they're looking at it?
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
it is because fama does change over time. You can be redeemed within your community for things that you've done. What I found really interesting was that even ethnicity could be fluid. And
Hmm.
what mattered was their ethnicity at the time of their death. So the jurors would say, at the time of his death, this person was taken to be Irish, which implies that, like, prior to their death, they could have been considered something else. And it's very strange. And I don't quite understand it, how in this ethnicity could be fluid. It's a different idea of ethnicity than we have in the modern period. And it's something I'd like to explore more. I mean, I can see how it would be fluid in the sense where someone who is English might adopt some Gaelic culture, but they would always be English. They would still always be English in the end. Someone who's Irish that has access to English law, they would still be Irish in the end. So I don't know, this idea of fluidity is just something it's fascinating and interesting and something I just want to sort of try to untangle. I guess
Yeah.
that's my next project.
Well,
How
it's
can
interesting.
ethnicity be fluid? We don't see it that way, really.
Yeah, it might be sort of analogous to what is the most recent box they checked on the census. There are
Hmm.
lots of people who are biracial, especially in places where there's a history of colonization, where, you can only check one box on the census. What is your background? What are you calling it? And maybe they're thinking of it fluidity in those terms, where maybe you have two parents that are, one is English and one is Irish, and
Mhm.
how are they most relating to the community within this context? Maybe it's more like that, but I don't I
Yeah,
don't know. It would
no,
be
that's a really good point. It could be like that. And we see new categories arising, as
yeah,
the populations mingle more.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I think also complicated by, you have Scots people living in Ireland. You have the original, the Norse, the Vikings that were there before the English came. It was literally a melting pot. So there was all sorts of the ancestry was very blended. So at the point that
Mhm.
I look at, it's so hard to untangle who is who. Without
Yeah.
those written records, it's complicated.
Well, this is a question that if you address in the book, I will need to go back and look at it. But you do mention there's a time out of mind and there's a time that's in the minds of man, in quotation marks. Do you have a sense that the memories of elders had any sort of more weight than the memories of just everybody, sort of an idea of everybody knows this? Is there a different place for the memories of elders when it comes to the social construct of memory or somebody's place in the community? Did you get a sense of that, or it's not really super clear?
It's not super clear, but there was one instance where that did come through very clearly, and that was in the writing of the boundaries of Dublin. So this was the perambulation they would do regularly. It was a custom that they did. And we have sort of scattered records of it over, 200 years or so, the records of the writing. And one of them, and it's pretty late, I want to say 16th century, maybe. My memory is a bit fuzzy because that wasn't sort of a major part of the book, but you do see that they consult the elders. That's a riding party. It's a party on horseback, literally just traversing the boundaries as they're written out in the 1192 charter from Prince John. And they specifically say in this record of the writing that they're consulting the elders for their memories. And the elders would say, yes, this place was formerly known as this in previous years, but now it's called this. And they could have sort of chart the changes that they've seen over their lifetime. So I thought that was really interesting. That's where the elders really shine through. And you see scattered in other sources this, references to ancient usage. So Dublin's laws and usages is one example that in the preamble, it says these laws were followed in ancient times. And it's very important to acknowledge these ancient roots of the written laws because it gives them more authority and more legitimacy. So in the writing, you see the elders sort of playing that role. Like they're offering their legitimacy and authority to this writing to establish these boundaries and reinforce these cities' boundaries.
I think that that is such a beautiful way of looking at it, and maybe something that is such a natural part of our lives that we forget about it, that we're looking backwards to elders telling us how things have changed. And when we think about history, like it is all a construct that we're building together, and we can disagree on it and it'll change over time. And this idea of social memory, I think, is very beautiful, looking at our own lives as well as looking back to the past.
Absolutely. And this idea that now we can draw from oral histories to learn that and to acknowledge that past. And, we don't have that for the medieval period, unfortunately. We have sort of an idea of the oral histories they presented. We have it in writing, but is that what they've actually said? We don't know. But now we do have the benefit of people recording oral histories and getting those memories and those experiences in recording. And I think that's just amazing that we can do that now. And if only we could time travel and go back and record those memories from then, that would be the dream.
Yeah. But then at the same time, we have an interesting lens where we have a collective social memory that's been built by a jury, for example, and shown to us. Thank you so much for coming on and walking us through how social memory and orality was working in medieval Ireland. It's just been great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Danielle. This was a lot of fun.
To find out more about Jo's work, you can visit her website at joanna.macgugan.com. Her new book is Social Memory, Reputation, and the Politics of Death in the Medieval Irish Lordship. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So we've been posting over the Christmas break and over New Year's, and we have a nice piece by Emma Cheslick about the cult of Mary's hair.
Mary's hair?
Yeah, the Virgin Mary. Fortunately, before she ascended to heaven, she had her hair cut. At least that's what the Catholic religion says. And pieces of that hair have kind of migrated from Jerusalem to Constantinople to Europe. You can even find it in parts of North America, like little strands of her hair in relics. And so Emma takes a look at that journey and why it's such an important relic in the Middle Ages.
Wow. I think that's going to be worth a read for sure.
Yeah, it's a very fun read. So we have that. Plus, we've been looking back at 2023. So we have our list of 20 open access books published online. I love making these kind of lists. Everything you think you want to read, from medieval literature to Byzantine history, lots of fun stuff like that. So we have that. And we are also doing now kind of a tradition, our annual look back at those who passed away among the medievalist community in 2023.
Yeah, I think that's really important work to make sure that these people are not forgotten, because we had a lot of giants in the field that passed this year.
And just so many others that were working in smaller colleges and universities, people that just even had like other jobs but contributed to the medieval field. To me, it's kind of amazing to look back at their careers and what they contributed.
I think that's excellent work. So thanks for doing that, Peter.
Thanks.
And thanks for telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you who support my work and that of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of amazing goodies like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. And if you're a member of the book club, I hope you'll enjoy my book, How to Live Like a Monk, which will hopefully get you started off on the right foot this year, courtesy of Abbeville Press. If your New Year's resolution is to support your favorite podcaster through patronage, I hope you'll visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from colonies to felonies, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.